Have you ever heard of the dark, forgotten history that Arab nations have sought to erase? This untold tale of the Arab slave trade reveals a chilling narrative that history has often overlooked. Number 1. Arab slave trade preceding European. So you've heard all about the transatlantic slave trade, but what about the one that happened long before that? Yep, there's a whole other story that doesn't get as much attention. We're talking about the Arab slave trade. You might be thinking, what's the big deal? Well, grab your time-traveling hats and let's take a ride back through the annals of history. Back in the day, the Arab slave trade was in full swing way before Europeans decided to jump on the not-so-fun bandwagon. Anti-black racism wasn't exclusive to one group. The Arab world had its own flavor. Imagine a time when the early Islamic Empire wasn't just about camels, tales from the Arabian Nights, and sweet desert oases. It had its share of dark secrets. Racism. Yes, racism is older than you think. And guess what? While Europeans were documenting their own terrible deeds in the 1880s, you could have taken a sneak peek at chained black African slaves and Arab slave trading vessels. It's like a twisted game of who did it first. Now, don't go thinking the Arab world was all rainbows and sunshine in modern times. Slavery was very much alive in Saudi Arabia and other Muslim countries well into the 20th century. Imagine clocking in for your 9-to-5 job and knowing that your boss could be, well, a slave owner. Awkward water cooler conversations, anyone? Oh, and speaking of surprises, how about African Muslims selling slaves in the 1960s? Talk about a plot twist in history, but let's not get too ahead of ourselves. As we journey deeper into this untold history, you'll discover the variations in the abolition of slavery across different Arab countries. While some were making progress, Mauritania had hereditary racial slavery issues that just wouldn't quit. Laws against slaveholders? Well, they might as well have been written in invisible ink for all the enforcement they got. But here's the kicker. Not only did the slaveholders not face many consequences, some were even compensated. Picture this. You do the crime, and then you get a bonus. It's like a twisted version of Employee of the Month. Congratulations on your successful slave business. Here's a pat on the back. But hold on, there's hope on the horizon. In 2015, Mauritania decided to create special courts to prosecute slavery cases. It's like they just found the instruction manual for how to deal with slavery tucked away in a drawer. Better late than never, right? Number 2. Abolition of slavery in Arab nations. So you might think slavery was abolished with grand gestures and righteous battles, right? Not quite in the Arab world. See, they had their own way of going about it. Let's take a peek into the unusual history of how slavery met its match in the lands of Arabian Nights. Variations in the abolition. When it comes to ending slavery, the Arab nations didn't exactly synchronize their watches. Each country had its own calendar for this event. Some, like Tunisia, got the memo early and abolished slavery in the 19th century. Meanwhile, Saudi Arabia decided to drag its feet well into the 20th century. Imagine telling a Saudi prince in the 1960s that slavery was out of style. Hereditary racial slavery. Now, just when you thought things were getting better, some places decided to keep a peculiar tradition alive. Mauritania, for instance, still had hereditary racial slavery until fairly recently. Yep, that means you'd be born into slavery if your ancestors were slaves. Talk about inheriting an unfortunate family heirloom. Laws against slaveholders. The problem wasn't just that they were slow to abolish slavery. Even when they did, the laws against slaveholders often gathered dust on the shelves. Enforcement wasn't exactly their strong suit. It's like having a no parking sign, but everyone's double parked. Compensation for slaveholders. Here's where things get even weirder. In some places, slaveholders were compensated when their property was freed. Picture this. Someone finally rescues you from a terrible job and your boss gets a bonus for it. Strange, right? Special courts in 2015. things started to change, albeit slowly. Mauritania created special courts in 2015 to tackle slavery cases. Yeah, you read that right? Just a few years back. They must have been on a history catch-up spree. Number 3. Castration in the Arab slave trade. So, picture this. The Arab slave trade is chugging along, and they decide, you know what would make this whole slavery business even more messed up? Let's castrate some guys. Why, you ask? Well, they had some crazy reasons. First off, economic incentives. They believed that eunuchs could be trusted more around the harem, which was basically a fancy word for the place where they kept all their wives and concubines. I mean, who could blame them? You'd want your royal privy parts guard to be lacking in that department, right? Now, it wasn't just about economics, it was also about control and dominance. By turning these poor guys into eunuchs, they could assert their authority and say, "You're not going to be starting any dynasties on my watch." But it gets crazier. Being a eunuch wasn't exactly a walk in the park. The physical and psychological trauma was off the charts. Imagine losing something vital and then being told, "Hey, guard this harem for me." Ouch. And don't even get me started on the cultural and religious beliefs thrown into the mix. Some folks believed it was totally cool, others not so much. So it's not like the whole Arab world was on the same page about this mad science. In the grand scheme of things, castration was just one more layer of awfulness in an already terrible chapter of history. Number 4. Impact on African societies. The Arab slave trade wasn't a walk in the park for the African societies involved. It's like they took a hammer to a finely crafted piece of art, smashing everything into bits and leaving a mess behind. Let's break it down. African communities back in the day were thriving with their own systems, cultures, and traditions. But then the Arab slave trade rolled in, disrupting the whole show. It wasn't just about taking people away. It was about tearing apart the fabric of African society. Families were separated, villages were raided, and traditions were crushed. Imagine your favorite Lego creation getting smashed. Not a pleasant picture, right? Now you might be thinking, wait, isn't this just like the transatlantic slave trade? Well, kinda. The key difference was in the scale and the recorded history. While the transatlantic slave trade was larger in terms of numbers and is widely documented, the Arab slave trade was like the sneaky cousin that nobody talks about. The impact? Well, it wasn't just confined to the past. The scars of that disruption linger in African societies even today. You see, when you mess with the roots of a tree, it affects the entire tree. And the Arab slave trade did exactly that to African societies. Now, picture this. You're in the 1400s and you're an African kid just learning about your family's history. Instead of a rich tapestry, you're faced with gaping holes and missing threads. That's the legacy of the Arab slave trade in African societies. Number 5. Calls for international remembrance. So, you might be asking, what's this international remembrance thing? Well, imagine a worldwide day dedicated to remembering the victims of the Arab slave trade. It's not exactly a celebration, more like an, oh, we should really learn from this history kind of thing. But it doesn't stop there. People are pushing for all sorts of ways to shine a light on this hidden past. They want research programs to uncover every last hidden detail, identification of historical sites and monuments, educational materials that make you say, wow, I didn't know that. In the middle of the night, cultural programs that teach us that history isn't just about kings and queens and museums where you can go and stare at artifacts that have a story to tell. It's like discovering a long-lost treasure trove of knowledge, but instead of gold and jewels, it's a better understanding of a dark chapter in history. And hey, who doesn't love a good treasure hunt, even if it's in the past? So remember, the Arab slave trade may have been swept under the historical rug, but there are people out there determined to shine a light on it, and that's a wrap. If you enjoyed this video, then you're going to love this one. Click the video on the screen right now and take a look. And as always, thanks for watching.